Hello, everyone. My name is Trell Cornelius, and I am a senior here at Chicago State University. Today, I will be going through a presentation pertaining to gender identity in childhood and adolescent populations. My topic was about gender identity, but more specifically, the exploration and the rejection of gender identity and gender expression in both childhood and adolescent populations. The title of my paper was Problematic Ideologies, where I discuss the consequences of rejecting variant gender identities in children and adolescents. The objectives in this presentation and in my research as well were to define and discuss various topics, which include gender identity, gender terminology, the effects of negative cultural and religious influences in terms of suicide and psychological stress, gender dysphoria, which is commonly referred to as gender identity disorder, and as well as to elucidate the realities of being LGBT youth or in the sexual minority at schools. It's important to understand gender identity, which is defined as a person's perception of having a particular gender, which may or may not correspond with their birth sex, which is defined in Merriam-Webster. Something to keep in mind is that there are different variations of gender. So some terms that are defined here for you are gender. Gender is the general category. There's cisgender, which means that your gender identity and gender expression matches up with the sex that you were assigned at birth. More specifically, I'm going to be focusing on transgender youth, which is the term to describe gender expression and gender identity not matching up with your assigned sex at birth. But there's also gender fluid, which means that your gender identity can change or fluctuate. Non-binary, which means that you identify with a gender that is outside of the male-female binary norm. Agender, which means that you do not identify with a gender at all. Gender neutral, which means that you identify not as particularly masculine or particularly feminine. However, you're a blend of the two. And then there's a term called gender queer, which is used to describe other non-normative gender terms like agender, gender fluid, gender neutral, things like that. In children, it's particularly important to discuss and research the development of gender identity as it begins in early childhood, usually between the ages of 2 to 3 years old. At this point, it is integral to begin the discussion of feelings children may have pertaining to how they feel, who they are, who they want to be. If you ask a transgender youth, are you a boy or a girl? Almost always, their answer will conflict with the assigned sex that they were given at birth. The rejection, however, of a child's gender identity will lead to troubling outcomes. This is a chart that I think is very useful when trying to explain gender to or gender expression to a child. The gender identity or one's maleness or womanness or girlness or boyness is defined as gender identity. The gender expression or presentation is what the child presents to the outside world. So, are they more feminine? Are they more masculine? Are they a mixture of the two? All of this will encompass their gender identity or their personal, the way they interact with other people, rather. The assigned sex at birth, male, female, as well as other or intersex. This usually describes someone who is ambiguous sexually in terms of their primary sexual characteristics. This can be a child who was born a hermaphrodite, for instance, and who cannot choose or is having trouble choosing between both genders. And then sexual attraction as well as romantic attraction are used typically to describe sexual orientation. So this is the LGB part of the LGBT acronym. It's important, though, to understand and discuss the negative influences on youth populations. In the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, it was found that in 65% of LGBT youth having variant gender identities or expressions, that religious messages contribute to higher suicide rates, either a little or a lot, or in other terms, to some degree or to a very high degree. 65% of children said that their parents' personal beliefs actually influence them or develop feelings inside them of self-hatred or self-harm or, nothingness, essentially. In the second study conducted that same year, it was found that 68% of LGBT youth report high scores of parental rejection have higher attempted suicide rates. So those that are saying that their parents' personal beliefs or cultural beliefs do not support their transition to their gender that they feel is right will oftentimes try to commit suicide more than a child who has that level of parental consent, or rather parental acceptance. The most startling conclusion, however, of this survey was that the participants polled, 40% of which were transgender youth. So, of these 68% that said that parental rejection was responsible for their suicide attempts, and of the 65% that said religious messages contribute to their suicide attempts, 40% of them were transgender. That is a very alarming number. In addition to the occurrences of suicide and the suicide attempts and ideologies, there is also a risk of inflicting psychological stress on a child and adolescent population, the greatest of which is gender identity disorder, also known as gender dysphoria. Children usually cross-dress as they feel uncomfortable in clothes of their own sex. They use this as a coping mechanism to alleviate any feelings that they may have as residual stress from not being allowed to live out their perceived gender. This usually emerges in childhood and it continues into the adolescent stage of life, where usually if a child is not transgender, they will identify with the gender of their assigned sex. So if they were born male and their parents socialize them as transgender or female, they will eventually grow out of it. However, if they don't and it continues into adulthood, then that is when therapy as well as hormone and surgical interventions would be prescribed or suggested for the individual. In the DSM-5, gender identity and gender disorder are given very specific diagnostic criteria for children, of which you need to choose at least 4 or more of the following. So there's the repeated desire to be, or the insistence that he or she is, and it goes down to the strong preference for playmates of the other sex. It is very interesting and very important to understand that teasing, bullying, harassment can lead to low self-esteem as well as negative perception of the child and those around them. LGBT teens specifically are 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their non-LGBT counterparts. This number jumps up to 8 times more likely to actually commit suicide if the family of the LGBTQ do not accept them. My thesis stated that the rejection of gender identity based on religious and cultural beliefs of parents and society contributes to higher rates of suicide, psychological trauma, and physical abuse in childhood and adolescent populations. This was proved and validated by several governing bodies that have dedicated time and resources to the exploration of this trend. Where most practitioners tend to disagree is the level of socialization that a child or a minor should be given. Personally, I think that they should lead toward letting the child be socialized in their perceived gender. This will allow the child to explore gender identity in ways that are non harming, and it is much easier to allow a child to explore their gender identity than paying for surgeries and hormone therapy treatments. At some point, the parents really must decide and evaluate whether or not the option that they are seeking is best for their child or themselves. Thank you.